There we go. So by now, Marlena has done such a nice job of getting my bio out there in the news that I feel like I don't have to spend much time on this. Um, but just in brief, I am formerly a technology executive and a corporate sustainability leader in San Francisco and Silicon Valley. I am proud to say I was the board president of the Bay Nature Institute, so I have some nonprofit experience as well. My wife Leslie and I have been residents of Oakmont since 2015. I'm a member of the Long Range Planning Committee, the Oakmont 2030 Subcommittee, the Environmental Stewardship Committee that Leslie chairs, and I'm also a zone communicator. Perhaps a little more relevant to this particular discussion, as a futurist, I have been certified by the Institute for the Future in their future thinking specialization, a 5-course sequence they do on Coursera. I have graduated from their imagination leadership training. I'm a member of the Urgent Optimist community, which we will talk about later today. And I did receive an Imagination Leadership Award in 2022. Let's talk about the future, starting with the future of this particular presentation. What are we going to cover? I don't know.
I can see it on here and hear you.
Sorry, I don't have a volume control on this device. It doesn't appear. Yeah, this is a test. You can hear me now? Okay. Are you still, is it louder yet? Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so the first thing we'll start with is in talking about the future, let's talk about when is the future. Then we'll introduce the concept of why would one want to do futures thinking and why would we want to do it here in Oakmont? Because some might see that as a bit contradictory. So we're just going to put that elephant in the room right squarely on the table if it'll fit. So we'll see how that works. And then we'll talk, of course, about what is futures thinking. I'll share with you 5 principles for how to think like a futurist. Then I will talk about the urgent optimism, both the program and in particular what that mindset represents in these times. We will do a brief discussion of the just 6 tools among many that one can use to prepare for the future. Each of these would be worth a deeper dive, but for today, you'll just get a quick overview. Then we'll summarize by sharing what are the key thinking practices that someone uses in doing futures thinking. I will touch briefly on my personal perspective on futures thinking, not just as a tool set, but as a way of living. And then a slide of additional resources, which in itself could have been a whole presentation. So let me start with a question, at least to the folks in the room. When you think about the future, when is that in your mind? If I said, tell me about the future, what time frame would you look at? Starting right now and the next minute from now. Who else has a perspective on when is the future? Could it be 5 minutes from now? Possibly. How about next week? When we think about the future, do we all have plans for next week or things we're thinking about in the future? You know, perhaps in October, is that the future? Next year, that's a frame of the future, right? How about the next century? Probably a number of us may not be here, I would guess. So would we think about the future? How about at the end of the universe? Physicists think about this all the time. What is the future? So if you're a futures thinker in the sense that the Institute for the Future has trained us and other institutions like it, you know when the future is. It happens to be Tuesday, and it happens to be September 13th of 2033. Okay, so why is the future exactly 10 years from today? more or less, maybe a day off, but that's what really the framing that we use. There's two important things to think about. One is when you think about the future, if you think about what we're doing next week, next month, next year, which is very valid and important in our lives, but we tend to be constrained by budgets if we're an organization, or by processes, or maybe the next election will change something, or a lot of things that are sort of already in play, or we think about technology developments that are already in product roadmaps. So we think about constraints if we think about the future in the next year or two or three. But at the same time, if we think about the future 100 years from now, when most of us are not likely to be here, we might kind of move into the Jetsons mode. Well, the future, it's all going to be, Rosie the robot and Astro the dog and I don't know, space cities or something. We tend to go into a speculative place where we're not really able to constructively think about futures that we want to create. So to a futurist who's doing futures thinking, 10 years from now, it gives you that flexibility to say, I'm not constrained by the current budgets or processes, but I'm also thinking about a time when I may well be around here, and when a number of people who matter a lot to me are going to be around here. This is a quote from Bill Gates. It's actually a restatement of Amara's law, which is more technology focused. Bill was always good for copying somebody else's good idea and putting his label on it. So not surprisingly, he kind of nailed this one. Most people overestimate what they can achieve in a year and underestimate what they can achieve in 10 years. So the idea for a futures thinker is to balance that, to move into a place where we are not underestimating that possibility of what could change in the next 10 years. So the next question, why would we do futures thinking? Let's start in general. Why is futures thinking valuable? Based on data and research that IFTF and others have done. Well, it allows us to build a sense of understanding. We don't claim to know exactly what's going to happen, but we can look at different scenarios about the future and hopefully build some sort of collective understanding, but at least a personal one, of possibilities. Futures thinking is demonstrably linked to mental health and resilience. And I think in these times, all of us could benefit from that. And we certainly know that there's a crisis in our younger community in terms of mental health. And so any tools and behaviors and mindsets that we can adopt and encourage that lead to stronger resilience, I think are valuable. Finally, the futures thinking gives us a sense of purpose. The purpose comes from the sense that we can influence the future. We're not just spectators. We're able to change it, to at least to some degree. All right, now for that elephant in the room. Okay, this is a mature, wise audience, clearly. So why here in Oakmont? Why would somebody care to think about the long future, 10 years or more from now, in a 55 plus community? I'd love to get to some of your perspectives. Why would you, I mean, you're attending a Futures Club meeting, so by definition, you're the target audience here. Why do we care about the future if we're likely to say that most of our personal lifespan is behind us rather than in front of us? That's a great answer. We want to know the future right here in Oakmont is one aspect of it. Anybody else with the yes? No. So I think Sue's answer was that we would help shape the future, not just understand it, but we'd use possibly this kind of thinking to help influence it. Yes. Right, to be better prepared. Right, because there are ways to be prepared even for surprises if one has a flexible and resilient mindset. One more, Carolyn. That's a beautiful answer. Yes, go ahead, one more. Yes, we have a lot of resources that can be applied, and I want to emphasize Carolyn's point also that others before us cared about the future, which is why we are in the wonderful place that we are, and like to do that, possibly pay it forward. Okay. Yep, that's although as many of us find that time gets filled up rather rapidly, but at least in terms of paid or employment requirements, most of us have some flexibility. Yes, so the idea is that we have the time, that we are capable. It's a community that has some abundance. Let me just, I think I've heard these, but let me summarize, what my framing of why here. First of all, these skills serve us in the present. They're not, even though we're thinking about the future, that sense of resilience is of value to us as individuals and a community. Secondly, as was noticed, we live here, we potentially could live here a long time, to reach the even the median age span. People who move in here at 55, 60, 65 could live here for decades. So we want this to be a vibrant place. And when we choose to move out of here in whatever fashion we depart Oakmont, we leave a legacy, and we want to make sure that's a good legacy. Let me give you some examples then. As we think about futures thinking, we think about who is doing this, and might picture like the nice people at the Institute for the Future down in Palo Alto with their whiteboards and yellow stickies. And so there are futurists who are, kind of meet the image that you might hold. But here's some other examples. Some are obvious, maybe some a little less so. Technology companies are doing futures thinking, and not just about their products. As we look at the rollout of the AI, generative AI technology like ChatGPT and others, we are seeing real discussions about ethics and about the responsibilities that they have to the future. City governments like Petaluma and Santa Rosa coming up with ways to make all of their community more resilient. They're doing futures thinking. Venture capitalists, of course, deciding what in the future might be a problem important enough to solve that I want to invest in somebody who's trying to address it early on. On the other side of that table from the venture capitalist sits an entrepreneur with an idea that they'd like to get funded. They're thinking about the future. Universities planning not only new courses, new majors, but how in general, new forms of pedagogy. What's the way that we're going to educate in a time when technology knowledge is so short-lived that teaching young people just facts about what's currently available doesn't really serve them. Here's one you might not think about. Our community in the Urgent Optimist is filled with artists who are both thinking about kind of cool ways that they might be able to create art, or challenges they're going to face when Midjourney starts to produce all kinds of artwork that using AI technology that may be stealing, uploading some of the work they've already produced for free, but also thinking about inspiring messages. So artists are part of the futures thinking world. Food companies thinking about obviously their profit, but also about trends, macro trends in diet and economics, technology, GMOs. Scientists trying to prevent the next pandemic. We heard that come up in our discussion already. Not just, what's the next virus we're going to tackle with mRNA vaccines, which is important, but how do we prevent this in the first place? Futurists would think about the technology, but also about the social behavior. What can we do to improve the rate of vaccination the next time? Not just the efficacy of the vaccines. What can we do? What worked well in terms of adoption of masking? And did masking work well? These are the kinds of questions that futurists would ask. Activists of all kinds, thinking about the future and how to change it and how to encourage others to act in conjunction with that. Futurists could be a family that's trying to decide whether to emigrate. And if so, where do they move? A futurist could be you, all of us, everyone in this room, on this call, and well beyond, thinking about the life that you lead and where you want to be, what you'd want to create, and what kind of world you want to live in. All right, so let's talk about 5 core principles for thinking like a futurist. And these come from Marina Gorbis, who's the chair or the executive director of the Institute for the Future, and a wonderful, wonderful person. First of all, we'll cover each of these in more depth. So let me just kind of walk through them. The first one is forget about predictions. Being a futures thinker is not making predictions about what's going to happen. More importantly, instead of making predictions, what we do is focus on signals. What's emerging as a sign of what's to come? Futurists also look back to see forward. It's not just speculation about what's to come. We have to understand where we've been. Using all of this, then we uncover patterns. So we don't make predictions about specific events happening at specific times, but we can see overall patterns that may be influencing what's going on now. And finally, creating a community. Futures thinking is not a game to be played by oneself. Every one of us can be a futures thinker and do research, gather your own signals, but sharing them, debating them, and sharing what the possible implications are. This is a team sport. So first of all, forget about predictions. And so if somebody declares that they're a futurist, and in fact they have a prediction because they're going to tell you what the S&P 500 is going to be at a year from now, don't believe them. That is not what we talk about in terms of the futures. So it is true, we are getting better at making certain kinds of point predictions in certain specific areas that are important to us. Our fire safety, right, since 2017. We have a community in the state of California and elsewhere have learned a lot about what it takes to harden a home, harden a garden. We have much better sensor technology. We've invested in technology resources in terms of firefighting. So we are able to make predictions about a drought that is likely to induce greater risk of fire and respond to that. So that we are good at. But what is not even possible to predict, not just difficult, it's not possible to predict, are major societal transformations. There's plenty of wonderful books that declare, what the US-China relationship will be like in 2040 or whatever, and they're fascinating to read. There's sometimes some very good thinking in there. But the problem is that the complex transformations that are underway happen at the intersection of really large systems like the economy, like governance, like national boundaries, and like people's societal behaviors, technology breakthroughs. Each of these, when there's a breakthrough, influences the other. I'll give you 1 second. So each of these will then, so a breakthrough in society, a change, will influence what technologies are adopted, and that in turn will change what kind of economics occur. So each of these is a feedback loop into the other. And this, we can't really even make a reasonable weather prediction 2 weeks from now. So the idea that we're going to say 3 years from now how the world's going to work at some complex level of interaction, that isn't really possible. But right. So what we heard here is that from someone who has some expertise in this in the product world is the first rule of forecasting, it's always wrong. But that's a good thing. If you understand that, then you can use imaginative thinking to say what might happen and how we respond to it. It's when you're wed to your predictions that it gets tricky. Another way to think about this, a good metaphor to my way of thinking about it, is what we call waves and tides. So waves are what we see. If you're at the shore and you see waves coming in, we see what we call surface events. And waves are important and interesting. They're beautiful and they can be dangerous. So it's good to see when waves are coming in. But you can't really predict exactly how tall the next wave will be or when the next wave will be. You just know that they're coming. So those are surface events. What we're interested in is understanding tidal forces. So we know the nature of waves. We know how often on average they come in. We know when the outliers are or how often they are. That allows us to do thinking about readiness without having to predict exactly when the next wave will land or how tall it will be. It also allows us to think about new possibilities for responding. So the second core principle of futures thinking, my personal favorite, is to focus on signals. This is also one of the most fun aspects of it. So a signal is not just information. It's information that indicates change. And sometimes those are obvious, sometimes they're subtle. First of all, this is probably the favorite quote for any futures presentation. So I would be kicked out of the Urgent Optimist community if I didn't include it here. Um, this is William Gibson, the famous science fiction writer, who wrote, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." So when I was working in Silicon Valley, we assumed that meant us, right? Because we're nothing if not confident when you're in Silicon Valley. So we assumed that meant that we were sort of the masters of emerging technology, and therefore everybody, we're kind of living the front, and everybody else is sort of keeping up. But as it turns out, of course, that is at best a partial truth. Certainly in certain areas of technology, Silicon Valley and what's going there is very important. But a lot of the biggest breakthroughs in terms of how societies behave has actually occurred all around the world. Just as one example, the idea of using a cell phone, in this case a flip phone, for mobile payments, that really originated in Africa because they didn't have wired lines and they weren't about to get a million iPhones. So they figured out how to use text messaging to make secure payments way before any of us were doing that. So emerging signals about the future, you want to be a global thinker if you want to understand what's going on, because these can happen all around us, often in the margins, in communities that are not necessarily the mainstream, or in geographies that are certainly not necessarily the United States. So what does a signal do? It makes you ask questions. It's not just a piece of information to click on and say, well, that was interesting. It makes you ask, why is this happening? What's underneath it? What is that tidal force that goes along with this particular wave? What's going on here? And what does it link to? Or what else could it influence? What does it represent? Perhaps even metaphorically. And then, of course, with signals, as I said before, we want to share them. It's one thing to sit in our own living room and speculate on them, and that's a good thing. But then let's co-sense together the meaning of these. Let me give you three recent examples of signals, and these aren't necessarily the most important things that I've heard of this week. That's precisely what makes them an interesting signal, is some little tidbit that might have a broader implication. In India, they've recently passed a law that said climate change is now a required course of study for every university graduate, no matter what their major is. So that seems pretty interesting to me. And one of the questions, is it now time, because maybe you're aware that India is right at this moment about to become the most populous country in the world, passing China, #1. And somewhere in this year, they will become the largest and certainly the fastest growing country and economy. So does it say that there's a signal that it's time for that story to be a part of formal education in other places as well? This was one I thought was a bit interesting. Bumble is a dating app. I'm sure that many of you use this regularly, but Leslie, I hope you're not one of hopefully you don't know what Bumble is. I feel better already. Um, the Bumble is one of the dating apps, and they have announced that they are making a very concerted effort to do three things. First of all, to shut down bots. They realize that a lot of the people that they thought were people are, scripts or AI engines. Secondly, they're going to start punishing people who are members who ghost even on a single date. If you don't show up on a date, you're going to be marked. They're essentially going to call that bullying. And thirdly, they're going to focus on something called doxing. If you're not familiar with it, that's where someone in a network who has personal information that can identify another person shares that in a broader way with the intention to cause them harm. And unfortunately, apparently that's not atypical behavior in some social media. So while they're weeding this out, getting out the bots, which sounds like a good idea, and changing the penalty level for ghosting on dates, what question might you ask? Well, this brings to my mind a question about not just Bumble or one dating app, but what do platforms, what responsibility do they have to help mediate trust? And what ability do they have to actually do that? How do we create social currency that's meaningful? And we might say, well, I think it's a great idea that they're going to eliminate doxing. And I'm not on Bumble, but sounds like a very responsible thing to do. Well, what happens when a whole nation the size of China rolls out a social currency system to cause their citizenry to engage in more compliant behavior, which in fact they have done? And people carry a phone around, and most people there have points essentially for how good their behavior has been. And depending on how good one's behavior has been in the eyes of the Chinese government, you're allowed to travel or not, among other things. So where does that sense that, well, everyone would know what good behavior is, maybe at some point that conformity itself is a risk? Finally, this was an interesting signal. So the New York Police Department is now using drones to police or monitor backyard parties. So if you call your neighbor, and rather than the old days, and I'll admit I've had this happen to me much time ago, of course, have somebody knock on your door and say, hey, it's a little loud in here. Could you turn down the music? It's kind of late. Keep it down. Yes, yes, officer. But they don't want to do that anymore. Now they send a drone over instead of a patrol car. So how would you feel if you see drones flying around monitoring behavior, and who gets to call, decide, well, that's enough to send a drone. And if I don't like it, do I send up my drone to monitor their drone? I mean, how do we, where does this end? So what trade-offs do communities make between privacy and between compliance? Because if you've been next to one of those noisy parties, maybe you'd appreciate having some kind of authority figure there. So these are examples of signals in and of themselves, just a piece of information, but the kind of questions a future thinker asks about what are the broader implications. Right, the third of the 5 principles is to look back to see forward. So remember, of course, there's no data about the future because it hasn't happened. But we do have data about the past. Now, the challenge is we can't just use the past to determine the future. Obviously, all of us understand that. But there are patterns that emerge over time. There's one recent example that anthropologists are unearthing, I guess we could say literally, that many of the societies and cultures, what we now call early cultures, that say the Aztecs, Incas, others, Easter Island cultures, then they try to figure out why did they disappear? And it's becoming increasingly clear that in many cases, overuse of resources that were within their ability to transport them, food, fuel, has been, in essence, ecological collapse at small and regional scales. So can we think of any particular group of people, perhaps all of us, who are overusing resources at scale? So those patterns through history can be, as they repeat, it can be important to understand that. So a good futurist is also a good historian and spends time thinking about the past. Try to understand the larger story, and then we can place the signals that we're seeing into context. We don't assume that patterns will endlessly repeat, but they often do, and it's certainly worth thinking about. So when we pay attention to those rhythms of the past, we might be able to understand long-term implications and at moments of change. And of course, I would suggest we're in one of those moments now. So the fourth principle, what do we do when we uncover patterns? Well, first of all, is to understand the pattern of patterns, right? This is a picture from Ian Morrison. In any particular area of life or an endeavor or form of society, there's generally the first curve, as you see on the upper left. So that's the status quo. That's the consensus reality. And then we see signals that are sort of emerging on that bottom left, that second curve. So for a long time, that's seen as outlier stuff or something that those people do or whatever, young people these days, whatever. But at some point, that starts to shift. And when that shifts, if you've read the signals, if you have the right mindsets, if you're resilient, you may be ready to ride that second curve, whether to live it or invest in it or help it along. Or you may be on that first curve and say, this second curve appears dangerous. And then you say, what can I do to influence it before it becomes the dominant curve? I want to not dive into politics, unfortunately. I don't feel like that's necessarily constructive. I'd say a simple example, so we're not going into too much of a societal one. I remember, doing a lot of work in tech where we were working on, rolling out apps for laptops and desktops of all kinds. The first time I saw an iPad, it was at a conference, and somebody walked up to me. Of course, it didn't even have that much programming on it. Just the first time I saw an iPad and turned it on and played with it for 5 minutes, I told my boss that we should drop everything else we were working on, that iPads and iPhones would be completely, that every other investment we would make would be harmful in terms of destructive to our capital value. I was probably slightly ahead of the curve, but it turned out I wasn't much ahead of the curve, where every bit of energy that at that time I was at Intuit, and every bit of energy we were putting into writing desktop software, as it turned out, was a negative investment because the growth of the iPad and the iPhone happened so fast. So in that case, we got to see the curve flip really quickly. Other examples are probably much longer, a 20-year cycle, say, of a political fortune. You'd say the rollout of libertarian values, for example, that happened over 40 or 50 years. And if you're in favor of that, it's like, well, that was a lot of hard work, but now we've got it. If that is less appealing, then you say, well, it might take another similar long period to flip that. So those are a couple of examples. And finally, as I said, this is a community affair, including this very group here, and we'll hope that many others in Oakmont will start to get involved. It takes a diversity of views. One thing that we learned pretty rapidly in doing futures work is that if you have, just as an example, if you have a futures session, a week-long immersion where every person in there is a white person, you're going to tend to see pictures of the 30 years from now where everybody, again, the Jetsons, it's going to look awfully homogenous. If you have diverse people with diverse perspectives and diverse life experiences, you get much more probably realistic and certainly vigorous and enjoyable experiences of creating that set of perspectives. We also need to involve experts from many different domains. I gave some examples earlier of the kinds of people who do futures work, and we want all of them to be involved. So let me talk a little bit about urgent optimism. So I call it a program because there is a group of us within the Institute for the Future who are part of this cohort. But really what it is a mindset. And urgent optimism is made up of 3 key psychological strengths that we believe benefit everyone who really develops them. The first is mental flexibility. You have to believe that change is possible, and not just frightening change, but you also can't be afraid to talk about that. So change, it has to include a balance, a realistic sense of hope. If you only focus on the positive, that's bypassing the real challenges that we face. If you only, right now, for example, in the world of artificial intelligence, there's essentially 2 views on offer. One is that, our robot overlords are about to take over. And the other is that artificial intelligence will solve all human problems and we'll all play around and play music and enjoy life. Those are potentially true. They're scenarios. They're probably not true. Really, there's a whole bunch of things that can happen. So we have to be realistic and balanced between the positive and the shadow. That way we know which risks are important to worry about and which opportunities to be positive about. In some cases, like AI, they may be on both sides of that scale. Finally, the third psychological strength is what we call future power, or what I would call efficacy. Simply to have projections about the future, however realistic they are, will only take you so far. At some point, the sense that one can influence it is a psychological strength that can lead one into urgent optimism. So you have to know that you can take an action, not necessarily to control the future. I'd love to be able to address climate change personally, but I don't realistically think that I, by myself, or even all the good people in this room or in Oakmont could, but we could make a difference. And then as other people join us, that can cascade up in essence. So what are the actions we can do to get started in any area? It's the belief of those of us who are in futures thinking communities that we can actually measure these and improve them. It's not just a qualitative assessment. It can actually be measured. And by measuring those and improving in these areas, you'll build your own personal flexibility, strength, and ability to help solve problems, the ability to create the world you want to live in. So what is not urgent optimism? Because many of us come into this a little skeptical. Unfortunately, these days, the word optimism tends to sound far-fetched. So urgent optimism is not a bias towards optimism. We spend just as much time looking at dystopian shadow possibilities. It's not wishful thinking. I have a great quote coming up from Rebecca Solnit about that. And it's definitely not toxic positivity, trying to encourage everyone to only see the positive possibilities and thus induce skepticism. The key is the first word, it's the urgency. To avoid these traps, we have to understand what urgency is. Urgency is not fear. You don't blend optimism and fear and create something useful out of it. Urgency is partly about readiness and partly about hope. That will lead us into a sense of efficacy, that we can be effective in addressing the problems that the world is demonstrating right now, either individually or collectively. So this is one of my favorite quotes. I've broken it into pieces from the wonderful writer Rebecca Solnit. Hope is not like a lottery ticket you sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Hope just means that another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. And so that, to me, is what hope is. All right, so we are very briefly, I know I'm using up all my time here and I want to have Q&A. So let me just mention tools. I know this is besides sort of, okay, here's some thoughts about future thinking. How do you get there? We have one game we play called 100 Ways Anything Can Be Different in the Future. So you take any topic and an example, shoes, and you list what's 100 things that a group of people could say that are true about shoes. For example, most people own more than one pair. You have to pay for them. I don't sleep in my shoes, right? And then you take each of those 100 things and you flip them. What would cause us 10 years from now to sleep in our shoes, or to only have one pair of shoes that served every purpose? What if shoes were free? And some of these are more crazy than others, but taking 100 facts about any subject that you can identify and then saying, just what if the reverse was true? It's really fun. There's a game we call the Foursquare game, where this allows you to sort of figure out in any particular area, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the outcome, and how much of a personal sense of efficacy do you have to address it? And then you can be wherever you are in there. It's not about always being optimistic or always feeling efficacious, but it tells, based on which square you're in for that particular topic, what kind of approach you need to address it, either to improve your efficacy or to improve its solvability. We have a way to do the backcasting, to look back, to look forward, actually an organized way for groups, a toolkit to use to, our general rule is, for whatever amount of time, usually 10 years, we're looking to the future, you want to look back at least twice as far. And then there's this tools to identify how you would identify what are the important markers of that time period in the past, and then how do they relate to the future. We have one called Orient to the Future. This one is fun. This is actually physical movement. So a lot of this is very head oriented. So we actually do some enactment about sort of imagine yourself stepping into the future and how would you behave based on a scenario that we create. Another event that we do pretty regularly is what we call a scavenger hunt. Somebody puts out a topic in advance, say for a week, we're going to gather signals on a particular topic. And last month we did one based on the global risk assessment from the World Economic Forum, all the hard problems. And so we spent a week really immersing in just how difficult this is. This month they decided we need to change it up. So right now we're working on the future of love. And some interesting things have already come in on that, which I won't go into detail on, but some of them are quite fun. We have another practice monthly, usually monthly, that we do called story time, where we get together and read either books by futurists or interesting novels that have passages that strike people in that sense. Yes. Yeah, I will get to the resources, but the answer is yes. So there are ways to unfold this. So let me summarize kind of the key future thinking practices that we've talked about here. First of all, think in 10-year timeframes. Not always, but that's a really good baseline for thinking about the future. Secondly, rather than making predictions, create signals of change. Take the information you're seeing and see what it links to, what it might be telling us. Use those signals then to create drivers. Try to see what are the tidal forces beneath the waves. Then you can combine those signals and their drivers into forecasts. And again, not exacting predictions, but possible ways the future could unfold. From that, you can develop scenarios based on what would it be like to be living in that particular future, depending on how that forecast unfolds. And then you can use those scenarios to discover what surprises, good or bad, might come forward. And how do I want to influence that? Are these futures that I want to just do anything I can to prevent, or to do anything I can to evoke? Finally, one of our general principles for future thinking is hold strong opinions. They should, hold interesting opinions, bring controversy to the table, but hold it lightly. It's to help challenge our own thinking and everyone else's. It's not to get stuck in a particular perspective. So for me, I'll wrap up by my thoughts on future thinking as a way of life. One of the wonderful things about the future is actually, surprisingly, it's a safe space. We can envision dark futures, but they haven't happened yet, and we can still do something about them. We can also use that perspective to help build bridges with other people, particularly younger people who are really challenged right now by those dystopian visions. We have to remember that visions of the future are value driven. They're not independent. It's not just a bunch of analysis. It's also based on the people, the values of the people who are doing the analysis. So it shouldn't be captive to any particular constituency. That's where the diversity of perspectives and people comes in. People need to see themselves as actors in the future. So this isn't just something where we're saying, I'm going to make an interesting documentary that people can sit in their chairs and watch. Remember what Rebecca Solnit said. We want to enable people to feel like they can make a difference, including ourselves. So future thinking can be abstract, but at some point it has to become real, at least tangible. As you've heard, I'm a big believer that there's a mindset of urgent optimism that we can bring to challenges, whether within Oakmont, within California, or at a planetary level. If we do that, there is still room for wonder and hope, even a sense of awe in our future. So I think this is an essential 21st century skill, and I'd like to cultivate it widely, hopefully with the help of all of you. So I have a bunch of resources here. I'll be happy to share this later rather than walk through it, but there's an amazing book called Imaginable by Dr. Jane McGonigal, which I highly recommend. The question came up, how do we get some of these tools? Joining Urgent Optimists, which last I saw is merely $99 a year, and we do a ton of fun events. It's well worth it. There's also, if you're sort of an online learner in the Coursera model, they do have that specialization. There's some other interesting resources, TED Ed, YouTube. California 100, if you're not familiar with it, does some excellent visioning work, and that is very specific to California, and then it's also broken down by region, and that would be worth a talk in itself here for sure. And there's a pretty glossy series on Netflix called The Future of, like 12 episodes. It's lots of CGI and effects, but it's fun and it is interesting. All right, thank you very much for your attention, and I would love to hear your questions.
Okay, let me take over for a second. If you're online, you want to put any questions you got into the chat, and I will handle them. And then I'm going to ask Linda if she will take the microphone to people in the audience who have a question, okay, so that they can speak into the microphone with their question. But having the microphone, I'll ask the first question. To a lot of us, there are current decisions being made that are about our future. Let me give you two examples. Many people, as they approach the 80s, are going to go through a evaluation of when should they move to a different lifestyle? Should they go to Spring Lake or Oakmont Gardens, or what? So they're making decisions about their future, but in a world where the future is changing as we speak. So you might speak to that. But before I give up the microphone, Oakmont is in the process in the next year or so of completely redesigning, supposedly, its website. How should Oakmont be thinking about the future in the design of the website? Because I know that it is very retrospective in the way it's thinking. And
Okay.
that's not really a criticism, but it's basically, here's what we have learned about websites that we will want to institute in the one we're going to do.
Great. Well, there's our 15 minutes worth of Q&A right there. First of all, in terms of George's excellent point about many of us, and all of us eventually, and many of us in Oakmont, perhaps a little before we even think we're going to be ready for it, need to think about the life changes that are coming. And this, to me, is precisely where futures thinking helps, because if it's very easy to think next year I ought to think about that. Well, I'm kind of busy still, or I don't really want to think about that. So but if we start thinking 10 years from now, it doesn't have to be exactly 10 years, but say 10 years from now, where would I want to, not just where would I want to live, Spring Lake or some other community, or still in Oakmont, reinforce my house in different ways, but think, what life do I want to lead? And if you can work backwards from that, then one of my personal rules of thumb is always, in terms of making transitions, it's better a year too soon than a year too late. And a futures thinking mindset at least allows us to somewhat bravely look at that. It doesn't mean I and others won't have personal inertia, but at least that's how I would frame it. Use that thinking to encourage yourself to say, let me think about it before it's scary and imminent, and I'm in a rush, or others are having to make the decisions on my behalf. So the website question, one of the things, I do think the website could use a dramatic refresh, and there's community processes like our conversation process that we've done that can help, but they can help in terms of capabilities we want. I don't think what we want is someone like me who used to lead groups that built websites say, well, I could, we don't need to hire help. I've got a brother-in-law who does websites. He'll give us one for a discount. It's really good to have some outside guidance on some of that, but it helps if the community understands, look at other senior community websites. I've taken a look recently at it's the Sun Valley one, the one that was kind of a forerunner, just because they're famous. There's the groups all over the country and different kinds of senior communities. They have very different laws, say the ones in Florida or the ones in Georgia or the ones in Iowa, but a lot of, at least in terms of their digital presence and what kind of messaging they think is important, we need to think about as well. Both the external, what do we want said about us when we present Oakmont to the world? So what's our external view, and what capabilities do we need? So I think if we decide what sort of functions we'd like and what kind of navigation capabilities, then we could, with appropriate assistance, build a really nice web presence. So other questions? Oh, there we go. There we go. So these tools are a combination of things right now that the Institute for the Future offers. And there are other groups that do wonderful work. I'm not claiming that, it's just I'm the most familiar with. Either through the Coursera program. So if you and you can register, at least the last I looked, you can still register for free on Coursera, but to get all the capabilities, you might have to pay a little bit to get the courses. And then all these toolkits are downloadable and part of that. And then some of these are urgent optimism practices, like the week-long scavenger hunt. Other question? Yes.
Yeah, you said you're working in Silicon Valley. I was also working in Silicon Valley. Therefore, I assume you are aware of this Gartner hype curve in
Yes.
technologies. And I believe this is also applicable to a lot of non-technology topics. There's always a hype curve. And it's important to know at what point on this curve a particular topic just now resides. It is kind of an over expected kind of hype, or is it down in a valley? And for example, recently we had this discussion on or presentation on Santa Rosa 2050, and they were talking about encouraging biking and investing in biking. I personally like it, but I believe there was a little bit also an thinking of some participants that this might not be something applicable to us. But in 2050, if you look at the society in 2050, who will be actually the main part of the society? It's not us, it's very young people, and they might like biking. Or also think about housing. In Europe, there are a couple of countries trying to discourage building single-family houses because from energy point of view, they are extremely inefficient. And therefore, it's better to have apartment housing. But think about this discussion we had with Enoka. Okay, they want to put apartment houses. Oh, how bad could this be? Man, it's really bad. Another example, 92, there was a book, Fukuyama, The End of History.
Right.
And because thinking was Cold War is over, and now it's clear who won, and now the future of all society will be a liberal democracy. But now if you look around what is happening in the world with China, BRICS, and all this, apparently it's not the case anymore. That means you have to be open to think about the future also, not only in the mainstream thinking that is telling, the media is telling you something, okay, this is what you have to believe. You have to be open to just think out of this box.
Yep. It would be a long gist. I would just let me just address the last point. Actually, there's several interesting points. So there's different ways to view the curve of how technology or societal changes gets adopted. The Gartner model is a familiar one, where everything gets hyped, and then you go into a trough where everything was, oh, that was a complete waste, and then the real work actually begins. And that can apply in technology, like with AI, oh, everything is going to be all AI. And then we're going to find out actually that GPT-5 actually isn't really that super powerful. It has capabilities. It's not going to change everything. So then there'll be huge disappointment. If you say, I knew this was just a thing, but then actually then the real work will start to get done. Likewise with Fukuyama and his book and his prediction. That was the problem with it. It was a prediction. What he said was, this is what's going to happen. The world has changed. We won. Everybody else is going to have to get in line. If he had said, here's an interesting scenario based on the Berlin Wall falling and all this, it's possible that the US and capitalism will be dominant for a long, long time. What other scenarios are possible? That's what a futures thinker would have done. And that would have made his work one scenario among many of his, and I would say increasingly clearly was wrong. So,
Bruce, I'm going to grab the mic for a second.
Yeah.
First of all, our website is oakmontfuture.com. And after here, we will post his slides, all the references that he has on here, okay, as well as the video of the show. I have a question from Zoom.
Okay.
Where are some places where young people are getting involved in this kind of thinking?
That is a great question. So first of all, I am happy to say that we have in IFTF, most of the people I work with are younger. There is a contingent of us who are actually interested in the future of aging, and not surprisingly, most of us are would fit right in here. But there are many people there, both within the organization itself and in Urgent Optimism. Another place where I'm seeing young people who are really thinking about the future, not just specific topics, but more generally, is within the Presencing Institute. So if any of you are familiar with Peter Senge and Otto Sharma's work on Theory U, they have rolled out through MIT and through their own programs a whole global community that has a lot of young folks in it who are driving change in many important dimensions. So I would strongly recommend looking at the Presencing, presencing.org, I think, but just look up Presencing Institute and check. Presencing, it's as in presence and then ing, so PRESCENING. Essentially, the idea is that you become present and you bring forth the future into the present, and that's a process he calls presencing. And a lot of younger people are very resonant with that. Yes.
Everything you've been talking about today kind of involves forward thinking. And my experience with people and their personality traits is that half the people are forward thinking and they're positive and they're looking towards change. And the other half are terrified and negative and see the worst. I'm on that side. It seems like before you could even start to talk in this manner and do these things and reach out to them, you would have to break that mindset that you already have if you're on the negative side. Has that discussion ever come up? Or how do you, what can you offer the people that feel like I can't change? So why am I in this discussion?
That's a very important question, actually. And it is one I've thought about. I would say that although I tend to be very future oriented, I don't necessarily see it always as positive, but I always see it as interesting. And so when we come into the work of doing something like Urgent Optimism, a lot of the folks who initially come in are pretty skeptical. That's why I had that slide about what it isn't, because a lot of people come in with the sense that this is going to take me somewhere either that's unrealistic or towards visions of things that I don't want to see happen. So I don't think that one's proclivity towards either positive futures or negative futures should prevent you from at least being open to say, hey, here's a program that I could be part of, or a set of classes I could take. It would take me 5 or 6 months. As I said, the traits of Urgent Optimism are measurable. And often when we start to measure, I know my score wasn't that high when I started. And I can feel that a lot. And it shows up in my personal life as well, in dealing with issues that come up day to day. It's to sort of reframe the thinking rather than saying, in the future, I expect, hopefully that everything will be better, or that somehow it's going to happen just because I took a course. So I view it as, I would say that it is a mental framing. It's an experiment. It's a personal experiment, no guarantees, but in a way, not really that much to invest to at least give it a try.
Well, I just want to make sure in the future, we are all going to have to pass our driver's test to make sure every 5 years we get to keep driving. I hope you are all aware that there is a new way for seniors to have a less stressful experience in passing this test. And so you do not have to get the year's book, read it from cover to cover for a whole week, try and memorize everything. You do not have to go online and take several tests that they're showing you as examples. So you'll be ready for the questions. You do not have to go to the DMV and stand in front of a machine and take all of that. You go online, there's a special program for seniors, and they teach you, it has 7 sections, and they teach you, like in one of the sections would be about parking. So they teach you 5 different important things you need to know about parking, up ahead over here, or parallel parking, whatever. And then they ask a question, and you're supposed to know from what you just read there, which of these is the right answer, A, B, or C. So you then make your choice because you've already heard the answer. And then it'll tell you, good thing, they pat you on the back. You did a good job there. Now there's the next question. And you go through that, you read it, you answer it. If you do not know or remember what the answer was, or you didn't have your little scratch paper and you were writing down some of the things in the lesson, you can go back and look at the lesson briefly, very quickly, and you look at it and then you go, there's the answer. It's like cheating. Then you go back to the test, you press the right answer, yay. And when you finish those, it's almost fun. It's fun to do. Then they say you have passed, and now you have to make an appointment for the day you're going to go in there. When you get there, you only do your thumbprint, your vision screen, and your signature. They look you up in the computer. Oh yes, you passed that senior's test. Here's your new thing. It'll be in the mail to your house. So if you didn't know that, it's wonderful.
Okay, next month, the topic is going to be something that's in the foreground of all of our thinking, electric airplanes. Actually, the funny thing about it is United Airlines has an order in for 200 electric airplanes that are going to be used for hopping between airports in the Bay Area. Okay, so it is a thing coming. Bob is going to take us through that. And thank you so much for joining us. And again, if there's anybody here who is not on our email list, John, you've got a piece of paper there. Could you stop by John's and give him your email and we'll get you on the list? Okay, thank you very much, Bruce.